Hello, everybody, and welcome to an interview session here with, I guess, what do we call you on this this occasion here? Author,
Author, I don't know, whatever you want to
writer.
call it, podcast producer.
You got many hats you wear.
I don't know, for a bald guy, I got a lot of hats. I guess the proper term is a Renaissance man. So
All right,
that's
so we're
me.
speaking here obviously with Mr. Thom Jennings, who's working on a special podcast right now. It's going to be
Hmm.
coming up. I believe it starts to release on Friday. Is that correct? We got February the 21st coming up here.
I know by the time people are hearing this, it may already be out, but it's Friday, February 21st, which happens to be the birthday of you. Happy birthday to you. And our subject, which is Vince Welnick, the late Vince Welnick, who was the keyboardist for most notably the Tubes, and then later on the Grateful Dead, one of the many Grateful Dead keyboard players. Here's a trivia question for you, Joey. How many keyboard players were in the Grateful Dead?
No idea. But I would say probably seven.
Officially, I think it's five.
Not too bad of a guess.
And the sixth was an unofficial member, Mr. Bruce Hornsby, who
Mm.
played along with Vince Welnick. In fact, the first year after keyboardist Brent Midland passed away, that's who Vince took over for. Bruce Hornsby was also in the band and he performed alongside of Vince. So for a little while, they had two keyboardists. And it was the second time that the Grateful Dead had had two keyboardists. And in earlier stages of their career, they had Tom Constantin and Pigpen. And Pigpen also did, and Pigpen was also a Ron McKernan. And he also did play, played harmonica and did some other stuff. So Tom Constant was with him for, I believe, a year. And, Pigpen died. There's Keith Gaucho. He died. And then Brent Midland died. And then Vince died. But Vince died afterwards. So uh, his wife said, and there's actually an interview where Vince actually mentions this as well, that when Bob Weir called up Vince Welnick to tell him that he got the gig as the Grateful Dead keyboardist, he said, I hope your life insurance is paid up. That's kind of a morbid
Yeah.
sense of humor, but
Eesh.
uh, but Tom Constant, I mean, everybody says these Grateful Dead keyboardists, they all died. I mean, there certainly were three of them that died while the band was active, but Tom Constant is still very much alive to this day. I think he just retired from performing within the last maybe 6 months.
Oh wow.
But and then of course Bruce Hornsby is still kicking around as well with his solo career. And when Bruce was in the Grateful Dead, and I actually didn't even know this until I started this project, they used to do a couple of Bruce Hornsby songs when Bruce was in the Grateful Dead, and then Bruce got upset because he was such a perfectionist when it came to his own material, and the Dead were just so loose that he decided he just didn't want to perform them anymore. So interesting little historical tidbit for you, Grateful Dead slash Bruce Hornsby fans.
All right, well, let's take it back to the beginning now and about
Yep.
how you got involved in this project and how it all came to fruition here.
As I mentioned in the podcast, I met Vince Welnick back in 1985. He was with the Tubes. They were touring with Utopia, and I mean, honestly, I was going to see Utopia. They were my favorite band in the world, still are. And they were playing at Darien Lake, and it's when Darien Lake didn't have the big circus tent. It was just a smaller amphitheater. I think the amphitheater is still there, and they do some laser light shows or whatever. And I was a cook at a place called Ground Round in at Marketplace Mall in Rochester, New York. And that's relevant because in the morning the produce guy came by and I was looking up in the sky and said, "Man, the weather looks horrible. I'm going to an outdoor show tonight." He says, "Who are you going to see?" I said, "I'm going to see the Tubes in Utopia." He goes, the guys were just having breakfast at the last place I delivered to." And I'm like, "Where's that?" They said it was the Treadway in Batavia. I'm like, "Oh my God." So after the show, I convinced my buddy to hang out there and see if we could meet the band. And sure enough, they pulled up on the tour bus and we were hanging out front and they all walked in and most of them went up to their hotel room, but Vince went off to the bar. So me and my friend Chris, we went and hung out with Vince at the bar. And then later on, Prairie Prince came in, Chasm Sultan, Todd Rundgren, which is the first time I met Todd, and Bill Spooner. The only members of the band I didn't meet, a couple of the guys from Utopia, Willie Wilcox and Roger Powell. And I think from the Tubes, Michael Cotton was the only one that didn't come down to hang out at the bar. But it was cool. Vince shared some stories and was very approachable, very easy to get along with. Pushed aside the little lounge piano player, played some songs. And what's crazy is like there were no groupies, there were no girls, there were no anything. It was literally the Tubes, Todd Rundgren, and Chasm Salt from Utopia, and me and my friend, and the bartender and the lounge piano player. That's all that was in the bar at the time. So it was quite the surreal moment, and obviously stuck with me because it was the first time I was able to interact with a musician on a personal level. I'd met other artists, like I met Graham Nash outside a tour bus, and all the guys from Asia. I met them at their hotel, but this was the first guy that I like hung out with and had it chilled with. So it was pretty cool.
All right, so how did the podcast idea come about?
Well, Vince committed suicide in I think it was not about 5 years after the Grateful Dead's Jerry Garcia passed away, and the Dead had disbanded. Maybe actually no, maybe it was 10 years. I should know this since I just did the podcast. But he had struggled with some mental health issues throughout his life, and it in that I had met him. I think it's kind of like the best way I could describe it is if you're a sports fan. Maybe you're a baseball fan in particular. And let's say you see a guy at the single A level, and they start to slowly progress, and then they make it to the big leagues, and then they're a star. Everybody always likes to say, "Oh, I knew them when," or you see one of your favorite bands when they're the opening act or at a bar, or something like that. I mean, Taylor Swift famously played at some hotel, banquet room out here in the Buffalo area well before she was famous, and people love those kinds of things. So I had met Vince 4 times before he went into the Grateful Dead. He eventually toured with Todd Rundgren, and he got me backstage a couple of times to hang out with Todd. He played at a club that I worked at, and then I also met him at that Treadway in Batavia. So I'd followed his career, and I just felt like, he got into the Grateful Dead, and I was all happy for him, and that kind of stuff. And, my life kind of got in the way. I never was able to actually see him with the Grateful Dead, which is one of my great regrets of life. But when he died, I just felt like they just unfairly wrote him off as somebody who had been, another tragedy of the Grateful Dead keyboard curse, and that was like his whole legacy. And I just felt like he was just such a nice guy and such a chill human being. And over the years, I've talked to a lot of people that were friends with him, and I just felt like his story needed to be told. He needed to be humanized and not remembered for, the tragic ending where he took his own life due to a number of factors. And, we'll discuss that in the podcast as well, because I think, mental health is just so misunderstood today. One of the things that was written about Vince that I thought was a really unfair criticism was that, after Jerry Garcia died, he was more depressed than his band members that had been with him with the Grateful Dead for years. And it made complete sense to me because I was thinking, here's a guy who lands a gig that he's making literally $1 million a year, which I came to find out that's what he was getting paid as a member of the Grateful Dead. And not only that, but just loving his bandmates, loving the fan base, loving what he's doing, and then it's gone. I mean, how are you supposed to feel? You've spent all these years as a musician looking to land that gig, you get it, and it's gone within 5 years. So I've always felt that was just a really, really unfair and kind of nasty criticism that I wanted to explore and maybe expound upon as to what were some of the mitigating factors leading up to Vince's suicide. And there's no little bow that you could tie that kind of thing up with and say, well, this is why he did it. I mean, there's so many factors that come into play, but I really want that to be sort of a less significant part of the whole story of Vince.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting story. From what I was able to gather from everything. Obviously, it'll be dropping like we said, by the time this video airs, it should be out for everybody to look at, and we'll have the way they can view it, the link or whatever in the information there in the video. So how long have you been working on this project?
Oh my gosh, mentally I've been working on it probably about 7 or 8 years, but it's since Vince's passing. But really, I kind of started working in earnest last year because I received a grant from the Genesee Orleans Arts Council to be able to kind of take the time and really do it right and put a little money behind the marketing part of it and things like that, and just focusing on it and kind of forcing me to bring the whole project to fruition. So a lot of interviews were conducted. Prairie Prince was really a very important part of the story. I mean, he hooked me up with some people, Bobby Strickland, who played with him in both Todd Rundgren's band and with Missing Man Formation and some other Grateful Dead offshoots. Dennis McNally, Grateful Dead publicist, Bob Braylove, computer programmer for the Grateful Dead, used to program Vince's keyboards when he was in the Dead to program the sounds, and did some other stuff with him. David Gans, who's a very important member of the Grateful Dead community, played with Vince in a few different bands. Michelle and Todd Rundgren both participate in it as well. I had some archival stuff from Fee Waybill. Fee wasn't able to participate specifically for this project, but I had some material from previous interviews that I did with him that I was given permission to use. And so, yeah, there's a gentleman by the name of Mike Duffy, who was one of the more interesting people that I've ever spoken to. He's Bob Weir's plumber, and Bob Weir,
Mhm.
the Grateful Dead, and also happened to be Vince Welnick's neighbor from across the street. He's one of the few people that kind of brought those two worlds, the Tubes and the Grateful Dead, together, because he knew Vince before he was in the Grateful Dead and knew Bob Weir at the same when Vince was in the Tubes. And then, of course, Vince's wife Lori, who really has never given an interview, and I was able to speak with her for 3 hours. Just an incredible conversation. I think that she's another person who's been kind of mischaracterized in terms of just I mean, she was a wife. She cared a lot about her husband, and she was very protective of him. And I think sometimes people looked at that her protectiveness as a little bit overbearing, but I don't think that was a very fair description of her. So
All right, well, it's gonna be good to get this story out and hear all about it. So I'm glad somebody took the time to do it, and so we're going to see that drop on Friday, February the 21st, which is, like we mentioned, his birthday.
yep.
And we'll see. You said how is it running? Is it running in parts?
Yep, it'll be a 6-part series. We'll have an episode dedicated to when Vince tried out for the Grateful Dead, and which other keyboardists he competed against. Just some of the kind of the watershed moments, the post Grateful Dead years. Just Vince as a husband, Vince as a dude. I've got some interesting stories of him. Another guy interviewed Scott Guberman, who played with him in a band post Grateful Dead. We got to see him not too long ago with the Pink. What was that Pink Floyd tribute band with Chasm Sultan and Prairie Prince and those guys?
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah.
I know the one whose name escapes us both right now, but he's Scott's sort of a Grateful Dead community kind of guy, just very easygoing. But yeah, we'll do 6 episodes. My plan is to do them every week. That may turn into every other week, just depending on time constraints and things like that. But everything should be out and ready to be listened to within the next couple of months.
All right, that sounds good. The Gilmore Project.
The Gilmore Project, yes, yes, yes. So, hey, if you want to hear a little bit of a funny side story about the Gilmore Project, it's not a Vince story, but we'll throw it in
Okay.
there. So when I wrote I interviewed Chasm Sultan for the upcoming show with the Gilmore Project when they were coming to the area that we live in here near Western New York, near Buffalo, and submitted the piece to the newspaper right for the Niagara Gazette, and the headline said David Gilmour comes to the Riviera Theater. So it's Riviera Theater is like a 2,000 seat community theater in Western New York. So I get a call from Chasm, freaking out that the headline was written that way. And I said, I don't listen, I don't write the headlines. So I had to get in touch with my editor and have him change it. But it was just funny because I was like, well, what would make somebody think that David Gilmour was going to be playing a 2,000 seater in Western New York? But yeah, it got me into a little bit of a pickle, if you will.
To say the least.
So yeah, to say the least. But yeah, and I do want to mention, back to the podcast. It'll be on it'll be available on all your major podcast platforms, such as Apple Podcasts. iHeart has a podcast platform. You can get on Amazon Music, and it'll also populate to my YouTube channel under the podcast section. It's an audio podcast, so there won't be any visuals with the YouTube version, but hopefully it's something that you can listen to like in your car or maybe while you're working out in your headphones or something like that. Just something that's a good little storytelling thing, and it's a
Mhm.
kind of a combination of Vince's life and legacy, and a little bit of some of the things that Vince went through that I personally can relate to as well.
All right, well, looking forward to it. I was one of the fortunate people who got a chance to get a sneak peek of it, the first episode,
You were
and
the you aside from me, you were the very first person to listen to the full episode. That's the God's honest truth, Joey. I sent it to two people. The other guy couldn't figure out how to open the file, and my wife hasn't even listened to it yet. So you, sir, although my wife, to be fair, has had to listen to me edit the thing, so she's heard the same quotes over and over and over again because I'm going back, and I think that's one of the things that people think, oh, you put together a 22-minute podcast, and if you listen to it, honestly, it doesn't sound like much, but you've got to line up your clips. You got to go through the clips, and like in my case, I'll go through clips. I'll take out the eh,
oh yeah,
cough, all that stuff. And it can just be, it's very time consuming. It's very tedious.
a lot of work
And
involved.
sometimes,
Hmm.
yeah. And then you got to get, you got to get all your sound levels right. You got to compress stuff. I was really lucky. I had a voice actress that was able to do the voice of Vince's mom. So yeah, there was a lot that went into it, and like even my parts, I'd record them, and as easy as some of this stuff is, I mean, I could sit here and talk to you for 10 hours and sound like I know what I'm talking about. But when you're recording specifically for a podcast, it can get very clunky, and so I'd record the same part 4 or 5 times over. I have to restart, dogs bark, and then I'd have to go back and edit and just find the stuff that works, or record an entire section of my narration, plop it into the episode, and it just doesn't work. So then I got to re-record something all together. So yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into it. Hopefully people realize that, because as I said, sometimes it just sounds like you're just some dude sitting there with a microphone. It's like no, there's a lot that goes into it. Reaching out to interview subjects,
Oh yeah,
doing research, all that stuff. It's a labor of love. But
yeah.
I do have a research background. I mean, I have a master's degree in history, so I love kind of digging deep for this kind of stuff. And who
Mhm.
knows, I certainly have enough material to write a decent book about the life of Vince Welnick. So maybe that's the next project that comes out of it.
All right, well, great talking to you about this project, and yeah, we're looking forward to hearing the whole thing, which will be coming up. Are they how far spread apart will the episodes be?
Planning on a week,
Week?
but again, it may be two. We'll see how it
Oh,
goes. We'll
okay.
see. We'll see how the rest of the episodes come out. But yeah, as I said, no longer than 2 weeks between episodes.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, hey, good job with the podcast.
Thanks.
Congratulations that it's finally out there. It's going to be out
I
there to
know.
people to hear it, and
Yeah.
best of luck on that. And any closing comments?
No, I just hope people enjoy it. I hope my final goal is just to portray Vince in a way that you can appreciate him as a human being, and honestly maybe go back and explore some of the deeper parts of his catalog, because that was one of the things that surprised me. You go into these projects, I think, with a certain mindset,
Mhm.
but then when you get into it, the project has a way of taking you in a direction that you don't always necessarily think that it's going to do. And I really felt Vince's presence, and I say that not as somebody who's particularly superstitious or religious or anything. And again, I met Vince 4 times. It's not like he was my pal or my bud. I was just a guy that he remembered a few times, and I just thought he was a really nice person. So at best, I would say we were acquaintances. But finding some of the deeper cuts and material that's out there, stuff that he did, not only with the Tubes, but just a lot of this sort of post Grateful Dead stuff, and even some material that he did with bands when he was in the Grateful Dead. Opening up for Jerry Garcia. It just really made me appreciate the how diverse he was in terms of playing and that kind of stuff. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with I really have a much deeper understanding of why the Tubes moved away from David Foster and decided to work with Todd Rundgren on that last album. I think a lot of it's kind of out there, but this was after talking to people, I finally got the answer in a very, very succinct form, as in, yeah, this was it. This was the non-starter, you know.
All right, interesting stuff. Very good. Thank you for coming on talking about it. And make sure you catch the podcast, and we will post all the links.
Yep.
And best of luck.
Thank you, my friend, and happy birthday, you and Vince.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.